Snow fell soft over a farm that had just lost the only man who knew its secrets. A girl of 19 stood at the edge of the yard, watching her breath disappear into the cold. Behind her, the house was dark. Ahead of her, past the frozen field, a second barn waited. Smaller, older, locked. It had always been locked. When she was a child, her grandfather had pointed at it once and said only 4 words. Nothing in there. Stay out. And she had believed him, the way children believe the people who tuck them in at night. But the man was gone now, and before he went, he had left her something. Not money, not advice. A single line scratched on the back of an old seed catalog in a hand that was already shaking. Don't sell. Look in the cellar first. She had not gone down there yet. She told herself it was the broken light, the steep stairs, the cold. But the truth was simpler. Going down meant the note would be finished, and she was not ready for the last thing he ever told her to end. Somewhere under that frozen ground and behind that rusted lock, a woman who had been dead for years had hidden something. Something she never spoke of. Something she meant to be found. The girl pulled her coat tighter, and she walked toward the dark. But to understand that door and that dark, you have to go back. A few weeks back. To the cold morning it all began. A girl of 19 sat in a truck that would not warm up, in front of a building that smelled of old carpet and other people's money. The defroster was cracked. The window kept fogging. She wiped it with her sleeve and watched the man behind the desk fold his hands. He had a kind face. That was the worst part. Kind faces were harder to argue with. "Miss," he said, and let the words sit there a moment too long. "We've worked with your grandfather's land for a long while. There's real respect for what your family built out on that road." Then he paused, the way people pause, right before the word, but does all the heavy lifting. "But a place that size, the debt on it, the condition of the house." He shook his head, slow and patient. "That's not a beginner's situation." She looked at him. She was wearing her grandfather's barn coat. It still smelled like him, like diesel and hay and something she had no word for. "I'm not a beginner," she said. "I grew up on that land." He smiled. It was the smile people give to something that is technically true, but changes nothing. And in that small, overheated room, she understood something she would carry for the rest of the winter. The whole place had already decided she would fail. It had decided in about 4 seconds. Before she said a word, she drove home on roads gray with old snow. The farm sat at the end of a long gravel lane, the kind that turns to soft mud in the shoulders and freezes hard by night. A white farmhouse, a barn, a field gone pale and stiff, and past all of it, a second, smaller barn she had not let herself look at yet. She pulled into the drive and did not go inside. She just sat there, hands on the wheel, engine ticking as it cooled. The man was gone now, 3 weeks gone. He had died in the kitchen one quiet morning, between one cup of coffee and the next, in the very room where she now kept her boots. He had left her everything: the house, the land, the barn, the debt, and 11 hens that he had never once named, because he did not believe in naming chickens. He left her one more thing, too. A note, scratched on the back of an old seed catalog, in a hand that was already shaking near the end. "Don't sell. Look in the cellar first." She had read it more times than she could count. She had not yet gone down there. The kitchen was cold enough to see her breath. She set water on the stove and stood at the window while it heated, watching the sky do that thing it does deep in winter. Not clouds exactly, just a soft, gray refusal of light. The coffee came to a boil. She poured it into the one mug without a chip in it, white, with a faded green stripe near the base. The kind of mug that has been washed 10,000 times and still holds its shape. Out in the yard, one of the hens made a low, complaining sound. She had checked on them the night before and found their water frozen solid. The little heater coil in the tool shed had a frayed cord she didn't trust, and the feed was lower than it should have been for this time of year, which meant he had ordered more at some point. Either it never came, or it was somewhere she hadn't looked. There were many things on this farm that were somewhere she hadn't looked. She wrapped both hands around the mug. She tried to think like someone who wasn't afraid. The truth was, she had stopped going to school in the fall, walked out of a life she was supposed to want, a small apartment, 2 roommates, a place she could no longer feel anything for. When the letter came about the land, she had read it twice in a parking lot, in her coat, in the cold. Then she had driven through the night to be near something that smelled like grain and rubber and iron. People in town were already talking. She could feel it at the feed store, at the gas pump, that particular way a room recalibrates when a young woman walks in alone, and the room decides quietly that she is lost. She was not going to argue with them. She was going to outlast them. That was the only plan she had. She drank the coffee down to the cold at the bottom and looked, at last, at the cellar door. It was just a door, plain wood, a black iron latch, stairs going down into dark. She had opened it once, her first night here, looked down those steep steps at the pull chain light she couldn't reach without going 4 steps blind, and then closed it again and gone back to eating crackers at the table like a coward. She told herself it was the broken light, the steep stairs, the cold. But that was not the real reason. The real reason was simpler and harder. That note was the last thing he ever said to her. The last sentence in a long, quiet conversation that had lasted her whole childhood. And going down those stairs meant following the instruction. And following the instruction meant the note was finished. The way a book is finished when you turn the final page. And she was not ready for the last thing he ever told her to end. So the door stayed closed. For now. She washed the mug instead. She fed the wood stove and learned, slowly, how much it wanted before it would settle. She pulled on his coat again and went out to break the ice on the hen's water with the side of her fist. 11 pairs of eyes watched her cross the frozen yard, and from where she stood, breaking ice in the gray morning light, she could just see the corner of that second barn. The small one, the old one, the one that had been locked her entire life. When she was a girl, she had asked about it once, just once, and he had looked at it for a long moment and said only 4 words. Nothing in there. Stay out. She had believed him, the way children believe the people who tuck them in at night. But she was not a child anymore. She was 19 and alone, and standing on a farm that the whole town had already written off. with a dead man's handwriting in her coat pocket telling her to look. That evening, the mail came. One envelope, heavy paper, a logo in the corner she recognized from the overheated room, and the kind, terrible face. She opened it standing at the counter. She read it once. Then she set it down very carefully, as if it might break. A date. They wanted her answer by a date. A line drawn across the calendar, past which the land would no longer be hers to fight for. She stood there a long time, listening to the wind press against the old glass and the wood stove tick, and somewhere, out in the dark, a single hen settling on her roost. Then she looked at the cellar door, and she understood that the time for being afraid of a closed door was over. She picked up the flashlight from the shelf by the sink. She tested the beam against her palm, and she walked toward the dark, toward the last thing he ever asked her to do. She did not know yet what was waiting down there. She did not know that her grandfather's note was only the first. That underneath this whole quiet farm, a woman who had been gone for years had hidden something. Something she never spoke of. Something she had meant all along to be found. The girl put her hand on the latch, and she opened the door. The stairs were steeper than she remembered. She went down with one hand flat against the cold stone wall, the flashlight beam jumping ahead of her, and at the fourth step, she reached up into the dark and found the pull chain by feel. The light came on with a small electric hum, a bare bulb, yellow, swinging just slightly on its cord, and the cellar opened up around her. It ran the whole length of the kitchen above, stone walls, a packed dirt floor, air that tasted of earth and mineral cold, the kind of cold that doesn't sting. It just settles into you, slow and patient, like it has all the time in the world and knows you don't. Along one wall, shelves, rows of mason jars, catching the light, tomatoes, green beans, beets the deep red of stained glass, squash put up in thick golden rings. Each jar wore a small paper label, written in a careful cursive that slanted just slightly to the right. She knew that handwriting. It was his. Every jar dated. Every jar described. A man who labeled things, because a labeled thing could never truly be lost. She walked the length of the shelves slowly, reading the dates, and something in her chest pulled tight and would not let go. Here was the proof of him. All those quiet years. A man putting food away for winters he wasn't sure he'd live to see the end of. A man who had fed her at this very table, summer after summer, and never once said a word about how much of it came from down here in the dark. She had come for whatever the note meant. She had not expected to find him waiting, like this, patient, labeled, exactly where he'd left himself. She pressed 2 fingers to her mouth and stood very still. Then she made herself keep looking. It was the far corner that stopped her, past the shelves of preserves where the bulb's light went thin and gray and gave up. There was a second set of shelves she hadn't seen from the stairs, and on them, wooden cases, not jars, cases, each one holding rows of dark glass bottles, sealed at the neck with wax, no labels, no dates, nothing. Just that hard, patient darkness. She lifted one out. It was heavier than she expected. Heavy the way a thing is heavy when it has been kept a long, long time, as if the waiting itself had weight. She turned it in the beam of the flashlight, looking for any mark, any word, any small claim of ownership. Nothing. Just the wax, cracked faintly with age, and her own face bent and stretched across the curve of the glass. She set it down, gently, the way you set down something you don't yet have a name for. She counted the cases. Then she counted them again, because the first number hadn't felt real. There were enough bottles down here to fill a small room, and not one of them belonged to anything she understood. Her grandfather had grown corn and beans and vegetables. He'd sold them out of the back of a truck. In all her life, in all those long summer evenings on the porch, he had never said one word about this. She stood in the cold, holding a flashlight she no longer needed, staring at a wall of dark, silent glass. And the question arrived all at once. Quiet, enormous. Who made these? She did not sleep much that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the back room, listening to the house tick and settle around her, listening to the wind work its slow fingers under the eaves. And she thought about the wax. Wax took intention. You did not seal a thing in wax unless you meant for it to last. Unless you were thinking, even a little, about a future you might not be standing in when it finally arrived. The note said, "Look in the cellar first, as if there were a second thing, as if the cellar were only the door and not the room behind it." She turned that one small word over and over in the dark, the way you worry a smooth stone in your coat pocket, until the gray light finally came up over the field and she gave up on sleep entirely. There was no use lying there, chasing it. The hens needed water, and the farm, she was already learning, did not care in the slightest how little she had slept. The morning was the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. No wind, no drama, just a temperature low enough that every breath felt like a small transaction she wasn't sure she could afford. The snow had crusted overnight into a hard shell that cracked under her boots with every step. The sky was that particular shade of deep winter white that isn't clouds, exactly. Just a flat, gray refusal of light. She crossed the yard and broke the ice on the waterer with the side of her fist. 11 pairs of eyes watched her from the gap in the coop door. She filled the feeder from what little remained in the bottom of the bin. And then she stood there, looking at how little that was, and the worry moved in her again. The feed was lower than it should have been, far lower for this time of year, which meant he had surely ordered more at some point. He always thought ahead. He was a man who never let a bin run dry. So either the order had never come, or it was somewhere on this farm she hadn't yet looked. And there were so many places she hadn't yet looked. She pulled his coat tighter, and she went to find it. She started with the obvious places. The equipment shed on the north side of the barn was mostly empty. An old tractor slept under a tarp, and the tarp itself slept under a 1/4 inch of dust. 3 plastic mineral tubs stacked in a corner, all of them dry. A wall of pegboard with the ghosts of hung tools sketched on it in pencil, and the tools themselves gone to a place she didn't yet know. No feed. She checked the lean-to behind the woodpile. Firewood, split and stacked. A roll of galvanized fencing. 2 bags of softener salt gone hard as stone. No feed. She checked the corner of the main barn, the parts of it she'd already been through. Then the parts she hadn't. She moved slow, the way you move through a place that used to belong to someone else and is only now, reluctantly, becoming yours. And then she stepped back out into the yard and turned slowly on her heel, and her eyes came to rest, at last, where she had known all along they would end up. The small barn, the old one, the one with the door that had been padlocked her entire life. She crossed the frozen field to reach it. She walked the fence line rather than cutting straight across the open ground, a habit she was building without noticing it. The way you learn, fast, to read soil that wants to swallow your boot hole. The small barn sat off to the north, maybe 140 yards from the house. It was smaller than the main barn and older, built later by the look of one wall and earlier by the look of another, as if it had grown in pieces over the years. The siding was weathered to a soft silver gray. The roofline carried a faint lean to the east, the kind that comes from a building put up in a hurry, or put up by one person, working alone. The chain on the door had real weight to it. The padlock was the heavy kind, the kind with a shrouded shackle that doesn't give no matter what you hit it with or how hard. Rust had wept down from it across the links, staining the old iron a deep, bruised orange. She put her bare hand flat against the cold wood of the door. Nothing in there. Stay out. She could hear him say it, even now. The exact shape and weight of those 4 words. Not sharp, not unkind, just final. The way a door is final when you hear the latch fall. She had been a small girl when he'd said it. She had asked once, the way children do, pointing across the field. And he had looked at the little barn for a long moment, longer than the question deserved. And then he had said his 4 words, and gently turned her by the shoulder back toward the house. She had never asked again. But a man who tells a child to stay out of a building is a man who knows exactly why. She had no key, so she went back to the house to think. She made coffee and stood at the window over the sink where she could just see the corner of the small barn if she leaned, the padlock catching a dull, gray gleam. And she thought about how his mind had worked. He was a man who labeled. Every jar dated, every tool with its own place on the pegboard. And when something came back out of place, he didn't make a speech about it. He didn't scold. He just moved it, quietly. Returned the thing to where it belonged, and that small, silent movement was the whole of the correction. A man like that did not lose keys. He put them somewhere that made sense inside his own system, somewhere logical, somewhere a person who understood him could find if she only learned to think the way he thought. The trouble was, she wasn't sure yet that she had. She set the mug down, and then she went looking the way he would have wanted her to look. Not fast, not tearing the place apart in a panic. Slow, patient, reading the house the way you read a long, careful sentence, waiting for it to tell you where it was going. She found it in the mudroom. There was a board beside the back door. Old pine, gone dark from decades of wet coats and muddy boots, leaned against it. Hooks ran along the top edge, and most of them were empty now. One held a coil of baling twine. One held a canvas hat she still hadn't been able to make herself move because it smelled, faintly, of him. And below the hooks, a small wooden box, nailed to the wall, hinged at the top, with a little brass latch gone dull. She had seen it her very first day. She'd lifted the lid, glanced inside, decided it was empty, and moved on. That was how the first days had gone. You look for big things when you first arrive. You miss the small ones entirely. She lifted the lid again, and this time she looked. Properly. There was a key, taped to the inside bottom with a single strip of black electrical tape, gone brittle and cracked at the edges, and under the key, on a torn strip of masking tape, in his careful hand, one word: North. She stood in the cold mudroom with the key in her open palm, and for a long moment, she did not move at all. It was a small key, not a house key, not the heavy kind you'd expect for a lock like the one guarding that barn. Something in between. Brass, gone greenish at the teeth. The bow was a plain oval, nothing decorative about it. The kind of key a hardware store cuts in 30 seconds from a blank and charges you almost nothing for. But the tape was careful. The label was careful. He had written that one word, knowing she would find it someday. And he had written only that one word, because he had trusted completely that she would understand what it meant when she did. She looked up, out the small, frost-rimmed mudroom window, north, past the driveway, where it curved toward the road, past the fence line, past the place where the field ran flat and pale until it struck the dark line of the trees. The small barn sat to the north. Of course it did. She closed her hand around the key until the teeth pressed into her palm, and she walked back out into the cold. The key turned on the second try. She had to hold the lock body steady with her left hand and put a little upward pressure on it, and then it gave, all at once, with a sound like a single quiet breath let out after years of being held. The chain slid free, heavy and cold through her fingers, and pooled in the snow at her feet with a soft iron sigh. She put her hand against the door, and she pushed it open. The light inside was low, falling through two small windows on the east wall, each one hazed gray with grime and the silk of old cobwebs. The smell came first, and it was not rot. She wanted to be sure of that, standing there on the threshold. It was something older and drier than rot. Dust, aged wood, and underneath all of it, something faintly sweet and almost warm, like the cedar lining of a drawer that hasn't been opened in a very long time. Her eyes adjusted slowly. The floor was packed dirt, darker in the center where feet had pressed it down over years and years of patient walking. Against the far wall, crates, wooden ones, thin slat boards with small gaps between them, the kind you see in faded photographs of old general stores. They were stacked with a precision that felt deliberate. The careful, squared-off way a person stacks things they fully intend to come back for. And to the left, hanging from a single wooden peg, driven hard into a stud, an apron. She crossed to it slowly. The dirt floor was silent under her boots. The apron was canvas, stiff with age, folded once at the waist where it had hung untouched for who knew how long. When she lifted it off the peg, it held its shape in the air for a moment before it settled, as if it had forgotten, after all this time, that it was even allowed to move. Across the front, in faded marker that had bled soft into the weave of the fabric, initials, L-E-H. She read them once, then again. Those were not her grandfather's initials. Those were her grandmother's, a woman who had died years before he had. A woman she remembered now only in soft, worn fragments. A low voice humming in another room, a pair of strong hands, the smell of something baking on a winter afternoon. A birthday card every single year, in handwriting that had grown shakier and shakier. And then, one year, without warning, simply stopped coming. She stood in the cold barn, holding her grandmother's apron against her chest without ever deciding to, and her throat closed, and she could not entirely explain why. She had come out here looking for chicken feed, and she had walked instead straight into a room that belonged to a ghost. The crates were sealed, each one closed with a thin strip of wood nailed across the top, and most of those strips were still whole. She worked her thumbnail under one near the bottom of the stack, where the wood had loosened with age and cold, and after a moment, with a small dry crack, it gave. Inside, glass jars. 8 of them, laid on their sides in old straw gone gray with dust. The lids were the 2-piece kind, with a separate flat disc and a screw band over it. The bands had rusted at the surface, but the discs still looked sealed. She lifted one jar to the gray light of the east window. The contents were dark amber, almost the color of strong tea left to brew far, far too long. Thick, catching the thin light with a slow, deep sheen that seemed to move on its own. It was not jam. She knew that, looking at it. The color was wrong for jam. Too deep. Too clear in a way that jam never was. There was something alive about it, even now, even sealed away in the cold. She set it down, very carefully, on top of the crate, and she turned to look at the rest of the room with entirely new eyes. There was a workbench along the north wall. Its surface had been cleared, wiped down even, long ago. Except for one thing, a single folded sheet of paper, held flat against the years by a short length of pipe laid across it. She crossed to it, lifted the pipe aside, spread the paper open with both hands. It was a list, hand-ruled in pencil, 3 columns wide, the lines coming out uneven in the way they do when someone presses a ruler down with one hand and drags the pencil with the other. The first column was dates. The second was numbers. But the units beside them didn't match anything she recognized. Weights, maybe. Measures. A private language. The third column was a single word, written at the top, and she had to lean close in the low light to make it out. Yield. But the entries under it weren't crop yields. They weren't bushels or pounds or anything that came off a field. They were notes. Good body. Clean finish. Slight bitter edge. Adjust. Best batch since the cold came. She read them through. Once, twice. A third time, slower. These were not the words a farmer writes about corn. These were the words a maker writes about something she is quietly, fiercely proud of. She turned the paper over, and on the back, at the very top, in a different hand entirely, broader, less careful, pressed harder into the page, the letters leaning into each other, a single line. Her ratios do not change, not without asking her first. She read it, and something cold and quiet moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Her. He had written her. He had known. Whatever this room had been, whatever her grandmother had been making out here, year after year in the gray light, her grandfather had known about all of it. He had written about it in his own broad hand. He had guarded it for years behind a chain and a shrouded lock that no one in the world could break without him knowing. And then, at the very end, with a shaking hand and a stub of pencil on the back of an old seed catalog, he had pointed his granddaughter straight at it, Look in the cellar first." She lowered the paper to the workbench. Outside, a hen called across the frozen yard. And somewhere far off, down the road, an engine she didn't recognize turned over and caught and began, slowly, to grow louder. She stood alone in the cold, in her grandmother's workroom, holding a list of words she didn't yet fully understand. And for the first time since the overheated room and the kind, terrible face, and the 4 seconds it had taken a stranger to decide she would fail, she felt the ground under her shift. The town thought she'd inherited a debt, but she was beginning to suspect she had inherited a secret. She didn't get to finish reading. The engine she'd half heard a minute before came closer, and then it turned up the gravel lane, slow and deliberate, the tires crunching the frozen ruts, and rolled to a stop in the yard. She stepped out of the small barn into the gray light, the list still in her hand, and saw a truck she didn't know. A man climbed down from the cab, older than her by decades, weathered. He had the kind of face that had spent its whole life outdoors, in every season there was, and he moved the way men move when they've worked a body hard for 40 years and learned exactly how much it has left to give on any given morning. He didn't look at her first. He looked at the field. He walked the first 20 feet of it without a word, crouched once, and pressed 2 stiff fingers down into the frozen soil at the edge. Then he stood and brushed his hand on his coat, and only then did he turn toward her. "Heard the old man passed," he said, not unkindly, just plainly, the way country people say true things. "Heard you were the one out here now." "That's right," she said. He looked at her then, really looked, took in the barn coat that hung on her 3 sizes too big, the girl inside it, the age of her, and she watched the arithmetic happen behind his eyes. The exact same arithmetic she'd watched in the overheated room. Too young, too small, in over her head. She lifted her chin and said nothing. She had decided, somewhere on the drive home from the bank, that she was done explaining herself to people who'd already done the math. "Name's Reed," he said at last. "Abel Reed. Farm 3 places east of here. Your grandfather and me, we traded work back and forth for a lot of years." He nodded out toward the back field, pale and locked and frozen under the low gray sky. He always turned that field by a certain point in the season, before the ground set hard for good. He paused, and something almost gentle crossed his weathered face. "You're past that point now. You know that?" "I know it," she said. Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe. He'd been braced for an argument, or for tears, or for that blank, frightened look people get when you tell them a hard thing they don't have the knowledge to understand. He had not been braced for "I know it." "There's a window left," he said slowly, watching her now with a new kind of attention. "Barely. If a man got out here in the next day or two, with the right equipment, that ground could still be broken before spring takes its turn." He shrugged one shoulder. "After that, you lose the season, and a farm that loses a season, it starts losing other things too, one after another. They go quick, once they start." She understood the shape of what he was telling her. It wasn't a threat. It was a kindness, dressed up rough so it wouldn't look like one. He was offering, and she was in no position on earth to say no. "I can't pay much," she said, honest, flat. No softening it. "Not right now." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, at the small barn. at the heavy chain pooled in the dirty snow, at the open door, and the low dark beyond it. Something passed over his face that she couldn't read. "That barn's been locked a long time," he said quietly. "It was," she said. He didn't ask what was inside, and that, more than anything else he'd said, told her something. A man who didn't ask was a man who already half knew the answer, or a man who understood, deep down, that some doors a person needs to open for herself, alone, in her own time. "We'll settle up later," he said, turning back toward his truck. "Your grandfather and me never once let money get between us and a field that needed turning. I'm not about to start with his girl. And I'll drop a couple sacks of feed by the coop while I'm at it. Saw your bin was low from the road." She started to refuse, then didn't. Pride was a thing she could no longer afford, and the hens couldn't eat it anyway. "Thank you," she said. He climbed up into the cab, and then he stopped, one hand on the door, and looked back at her across the frozen yard. "He talked about you, you know," he said. Toward the end. She went very still. "Said his granddaughter had a good head on her." A pause. "Said she just didn't know it yet." And then he shut the door, and the engine turned, and he backed slowly down the lane the way he'd come, the sound of him fading until the cold swallowed it. She stood there a long time after he was gone, the list still in her hand, her grandmother's apron still pressed against her chest, where she'd been holding it without ever once deciding to. That evening, the second letter came. She almost didn't open it. She knew the heavy paper now. She knew the small printed mark in the corner and the kind of cold it carried inside. But she opened it anyway, standing at the counter in the lamplight, because she had already learned the hardest small lesson there is. That the things you refuse to look at are exactly the things that come for you in the dark. It was shorter than the first. A reminder, a date underlined this time, and one line beneath it, written in the flat, polite, bloodless language of people who have never once lain awake worrying about losing a home. A warning, really, folded into good manners. She set it down on the counter, right beside her grandmother's list of strange, dark numbers and proud, careful words. 2 pieces of paper, one that wanted, very politely, to take the farm away from her, and one that might, somehow, against all sense, be the thing that saved it. She looked from one to the other for a long, long time. Then she folded the bank's letter in half, and in half again, and she set it under the sugar tin where she wouldn't have to look at it. And she picked up her grandmother's list, but the list, she already knew, was not the whole of it. The list was the door, not the room. So she lit the lamp, and she took the flashlight down off its shelf, and she went back down into the cellar one more time. She didn't go to the wax-sealed bottles this time. She went to the other shelves, the ones along the back wall she'd walked past twice without really seeing, because the first time you go through a place, you only ever see what you already expect to find. Behind a low shelf of empty canning lids and dusty rings, pushed back into the deepest shadow where the bulb's light couldn't quite reach, there was a notebook, black and white, the marbled cover kind, the same exact kind her grandfather had used for his equipment logs, stacked neat in a drawer upstairs. But this one had no label on the cover. She lifted it out. It was cool and slightly damp from the cellar air, the cardboard soft at the corners. She opened it to the first page. And there, in handwriting she had not seen since she was a little girl, in handwriting that had come once a year on a birthday card and then stopped coming forever. Her grandmother had written a single line at the top: "Do not scale up until the press is mended." And below it, the entries began. She sat right down on the cold cellar floor, her back against the stone wall, the flashlight propped beside her, and she read. She couldn't have told you how long. Page after page, in that careful, slanting hand, measures and amounts, temperatures with little notes about the weather in the room beside them, times, adjustments made between one batch and the next, and everywhere, threaded through all of it, those tasting notes that read less like a recipe and far more like a woman keeping a quiet, honest record of her own slow mastery. This one needs more time, patience. The fruit from the old trees behaves differently. Shorter, be ready for it. Better than the last. Closer to what it should be. The entries ran on, page after page after page. And as she read, the truth of it assembled itself in her cold hands, piece by piece, until she could not look away from the size of it. This was not a hobby. This was not a few jars put up on a slow afternoon. This was years. Years of careful, deliberate, documented work, done by a woman who had measured in grams and fractions, who had written down the temperature of the room, who had tasted from a spoon, and gone back and adjusted and tried again, batch after batch after patient batch. A woman who had built something real out here, quietly, out of sight, behind a locked door, in a barn the whole family had been told held nothing. A woman nobody had ever thought to tell her about. She closed the notebook at last, and she held it flat against her chest, the way she'd held the apron, and she sat there on the cold stone floor in the swinging yellow light. She thought about the wax on the bottles. She thought about the careful, invisible quiet of all of it. And she understood, sitting there in the dark, that her grandmother had not hidden this work because she was ashamed of it. No. A woman didn't keep records this proud out of shame. She had hidden it because she had learned, long before her granddaughter was ever born, that certain things in this world are better protected by silence than by any lock a man could hang on a door. The lamp flickered above her, and the girl sat alone in the cellar with a dead woman's notebook held tight against her heart, and felt, for the first time in a long and frightening winter, not quite so alone. She did not yet know what the bottles were worth. She only knew that the trail had not ended, that her grandfather had pointed her here, that her grandmother had left this for someone, and that she, against all the arithmetic of every kind and terrible face in town, was the one who had finally come to read it. The notebook changed everything, not the farm. The farm was exactly as it had been, cold, mortgaged, counting down toward a date under a sugar tin. What changed was her. She carried the notebook upstairs and set it on the kitchen table, and she did not open it again right away. She just looked at it. The way you look at a letter you've been waiting your whole life for, without knowing you were waiting. Then she made coffee, and she began to learn what her grandmother had known. The work she'd built out there had a name once she understood it. It was cider, made slow, the old way, from fruit off the trees that still stood along the stone wall and at the edge of the field. Trees the girl had always thought of as decoration, Sentimental plantings, pretty in spring and otherwise just there. She had been wrong about that. Those trees were the whole reason for the locked barn. Page after page, her grandmother had recorded it all. Which tree gave more bite to a batch? Which one ran sweeter? How the fruit from the oldest tree, the one with the split trunk down by the wall, behaved differently than anything you could buy. Be ready for it, she'd written, as if the fruit had a temper, as if it were a person she'd come to know. The girl read it the way you read a voice you'd thought was gone for good, and slowly, sitting at that table through the gray afternoons, she stopped reading it as a recipe and started reading it as a hand reaching forward through years of silence, looking for someone to take hold of it. But understanding a thing and saving a farm with it were two very different mountains. She didn't know the first thing about what she was allowed to do with what was sleeping in that cellar. You could not simply load 100 bottles into the back of a truck and sell them at a roadside table. She knew that much. There were rules around this kind of thing. Permissions. Lines you could not cross without crossing into real trouble. And trouble was the one thing she could not afford. So one cold morning, with the date under the sugar tin pressing on her like a hand between the shoulder blades, she drove into town, not to the bank, to the small office at the edge of the square, the one where a woman had sat behind a counter for longer than the girl had been alive, answering every question a farmer could think to ask. The woman behind the counter was old in the way of someone who has outlasted her own surprise. Gray hair pinned back, reading glasses on a chain, a patience to her that wasn't soft exactly. It was the patience of someone who had heard every possible problem at least twice, and learned that most of them could be solved if a person just sat still long enough. Her name was Della Hargrove. She looked up when the girl came in, and she set down her pen, and she took the measure of her the way everyone did, but something in her face was different. She didn't do the arithmetic. She didn't decide. "You'd be the one out on the old place," she said. "End of the gravel lane." "That's me," the girl said. "Heard you were running it now." Della folded her hands. "How's that going for you?" And there was nothing in it but the plain question. No edge, no pity hiding underneath. For a moment, the girl couldn't answer at all. It had been so long since anyone had asked her how something was going without already knowing, in their own mind, that the answer was badly. "I found something," the girl said finally, "out at the farm, and I need to know what I'm allowed to do with it." She told it carefully. She didn't say everything. She said there was old work, made by her grandmother. Years of it, by the looks of the records. Apple, fermented, sealed, and kept. She did not say how much. She did not say where. Della listened to all of it without once interrupting, and when the girl finished, the old woman was quiet for a moment, looking at her over the top of those reading glasses. "Your grandmother," Della said slowly. "Yes." Something moved across the old woman's face, recognition, and under it, a strange, careful tenderness, like a door easing open on a room she hadn't entered in a long time. "I wondered," Della said softly, "if any of that ever got passed down." The girl went still. "You knew her," she said. "Everyone knew her," Della said, "or thought they did." She took off the reading glasses and set them on the counter. "Sit down. This is going to take longer than you think, and it's going to be worth every minute." She walked the girl through the rules for the better part of an hour. What you could do with small batches, what you couldn't, the permissions you needed and how you went about getting them, the lines you didn't cross, and the ones that, it turned out, weren't lines at all, just fears people carried because no one had ever told them otherwise. She wrote down numbers on a card, a few names of people who could help, and then she pushed the card across the counter, and she looked at the girl, and she said the thing the girl would carry with her for the rest of that long winter. "It's not as impossible as they made you feel," Della said. "It never was. They just count people out early. It's easier than helping." The girl looked down at the card. "There's a path here," Della said. "A real one. It's slow, and it's a lot of work, and most folks would rather tell you it can't be done than walk it with you. But it can be done." A pause. "Your grandmother walked most of it herself, you know. Alone, without half the help you've got sitting right in front of you." That last line stayed with her the whole drive home. Your grandmother walked most of it herself. Alone. She thought about it as the bare field slid past the cracked window. She thought about a woman moving between the house and that little barn, year after year, a notebook tucked under her arm, checking, tasting, adjusting, building something with her own two hands, and telling no one. And the question that had been circling her since the first locked door finally landed. Why hide it? The work was good. The records were proud. Della had spoken of her grandmother the way you speak of someone who mattered. So why the chain? Why the wax with no labels? Why a lifetime of it, kept in the dark like a thing to be ashamed of? She did not have the answer yet, but she was getting closer to the part of the notebook that did. She got her answer 2 nights later. She'd been reading the early pages over and over, learning the shorthand, learning the voice. But that night, she finally let herself move forward, into the middle of the notebook, where the entries grew longer and the careful hand sometimes pressed harder into the page. And in among the measures and the temperatures, almost hidden, her grandmother had written something that wasn't a recipe at all. She'd written about the day she started. She wrote that she had begun this work in a season when no one believed a woman could make anything that mattered with her own hands. When the men at the gatherings spoke over her, around her, as if she were furniture. When she had brought something she'd made to show once early on, and watched a room of people decide, in about the time it takes to pour a glass, that it couldn't possibly be any good, because of who had made it. The girl read that line 3 times. In about the time it takes to pour a glass. 4 seconds, a room deciding. She knew that feeling in her bones. She had felt it in an overheated office not 2 weeks ago, across a fake wood desk, watching a kind, terrible face do the arithmetic. Her grandmother had felt it too, a lifetime ago, and it had never once left her. That was the reason for the lock. It was right there, in her grandmother's own slanting hand. She had not hidden the work because it was poor. She had hidden it because she had learned, the hard way, that the moment certain people knew a woman had made a thing, they stopped being able to taste it at all. They tasted her instead, and they always found her wanting. So she had stopped showing anyone. She had simply made it. For the love of making it. For the proof, kept quiet in the cold, that she could. She'd built her whole secret world out there in the small barn, where no room of strangers could pour their judgment over it in 4 seconds flat. Better protected by silence, the girl thought, than by any lock. Della had said everyone knew her grandmother, or thought they did. Now she understood the difference. They had known the woman who baked and tended the garden and sent birthday cards in a careful hand. They had never known this one, the maker, the one with the proud private records, and the trees she spoke to like family. That woman had lived almost entirely alone. And she had left the only true account of herself sealed in a notebook, in a barn, for whoever came next, and was willing to read all the way to the end. The girl put her hand flat on the open page. "I'm here," she said, to the empty kitchen, to the silence, to a woman years gone. "I'm reading it, all of it." She might have sat with that grief and that wonder for a long while, but the farm, as always, had other plans. It started small. The way most troubles do. She noticed it first in the upstairs room, the one with the stain spreading across the plaster ceiling, dark as a bruise, where the roof over the back of the house had been letting in the wet for longer than anyone had tended to it. That stain had been there since she arrived. She'd been meaning to deal with it. But that night, lying awake, she heard a new sound. Not the wind, not the house settling. A slow, patient drip. And when she went up with the flashlight, she found the stain had grown. And at the lowest point of it, a single bead of water had formed, swelling, falling, swelling again. The roof wasn't just leaking anymore. The roof was failing. She set a pot under it, and she did not sleep. And in the morning, she went out to look at the small barn. Because the small barn held everything. The crates, the bottles, the years of her grandmother's work, sleeping in the cold. If the house roof was going, she had to know the barns was sound. It wasn't. She climbed up on an overturned crate and looked at the underside of the low roof, where it leaned faintly to the east, and she saw it. The way the old boards had softened. The way one whole section sagged just slightly, like a held breath about to let go. The way the lean she'd noticed that very first day wasn't a charming quirk at all. It was a warning. That roof had been carrying its own slow failure for years, and it would not carry it much longer. One hard load, one bad night, and the whole north side could come down on everything beneath it. On the crates, on the bottles, on the only thing she had left to fight with. She climbed down off the crate with her heart going hard in her chest. And then the worst of it came, the way the worst things do. All at once, the man with the kind face was not finished with her. A new letter came, not folded politely this time, sharper, a demand dressed up in legal calm, and with it, a thing she had not expected, a notice that the timeline had moved up, that the date under the sugar tin was no longer the date, that the new one was sooner, much sooner, close enough now that she could count the mornings on 2 hands. She stood at the counter and read it twice, and the cold that went through her had nothing to do with the season. They weren't just waiting anymore. They were closing in. She drove into town one last time to understand it. And it was Della, again, who told her the truth, because Della was the only one who would. The old woman read the letter over her glasses, and her mouth went thin and hard. "They've sold your note," Della said quietly. "Sold it. To someone with deeper pockets and faster lawyers. Happens out here more than folks like to say." She set the letter down. "Whoever holds your debt now," They don't want their money back. They want the land, the trees, the water that runs through that creek of yours." The girl felt the floor tilt under her. "Why would anyone?" "Because land like that doesn't come up twice in a lifetime," Della said. "And they think a girl your age won't know what she's sitting on. They think you'll be glad to be rid of it. They're counting on it." There it was again. The arithmetic. Too young. She won't know. She'll be glad to go. A whole new face she hadn't even met yet. Already deciding in 4 seconds that she would fail. She drove home in the early dark with her hands tight on the wheel, and the cold she felt now was a different kind. It wasn't fear, exactly. Fear had been the early days, the crackers at the table, the closed cellar door. This was something harder, something with a shape to it. She had a roof failing over her head, and a roof failing over everything her grandmother had left her, and a date bearing down faster than she could move, and a buyer she'd never seen who wanted to take it all and didn't even have the decency to do it to her face. She had 11 hens, fed now, but one of them off, standing apart from the others by the east wall, which sometimes meant nothing and sometimes meant the start of something. She had a notebook full of a dead woman's courage, and she had herself, 19 years old, alone at the end of a gravel lane. That was the whole of it. That was the army she had. That night, the sky went strange. It turned the color of old iron at sundown, and then it went darker than that, and the air took on that flat, waiting stillness that comes before something heavy. She stood on the porch and felt it. No wind yet, just a held breath, the whole world pulling in tight, and she knew, the way you know things you've never been taught, that whatever was coming would be bad, that it would test the failing roof of the house and the sagging roof of the small barn, and the girl standing alone beneath them both. She went inside. She filled every pot she had with water in case the power went. She brought wood in from the lean-to and stacked it high by the stove. She checked the hens twice, and she moved the off one into a crate in the mudroom where it was warmer, because she could not save everything, but she could save that. And then she stood in the kitchen, looking at the notebook on the table, and she made a choice. She put on her grandmother's apron over her grandfather's coat, LEH across her chest, a dead woman's name worn like armor. She found the flashlight and a tarp in the lean-to, and a hammer and a fistful of nails, and she looked out the black window toward the small barn, where a lifetime of quiet, secret, stubborn work lay sleeping under a roof that was about to be asked to hold more than it could. The first gust hit the house then, hard enough to rattle the old glass in its frame. She did not flinch. She had been counted out by a banker, by a town, by a buyer she'd never met, by every kind, terrible face that had ever done the arithmetic and decided she would fail. But she had a grandmother's voice in a notebook, telling her that the work was worth protecting even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. And she was not going to stand in a warm kitchen and let it all come down in the dark. She pulled the door open. The cold came in like a living thing, and the night beyond it was already roaring. And the girl, 19, alone, wrapped in the coats of the two people who had loved this land before her, stepped out into it, toward the small barn, toward everything she had left, toward the storm. The cold took her breath the moment she left the porch. Not wind at first, just cold. A wall of it. The kind that gets inside a coat in seconds and goes looking for the warm parts of you. Then the wind came. It came across the open field with nothing to slow it down, and it hit her sideways, and it tried to take the tarp right out of her arms. She bent into it the way she'd seen Abel bend into the field that first morning. Low, stubborn, one boot, then the next. 140 yards to the small barn. It might as well have been a mile. The flashlight beam jumped and skidded across the snow, useless in the blowing white, so she put it in her pocket and walked by memory instead. The fence line, her hand trailing along the cold rail. The thing her grandfather had taught her without ever knowing he was teaching her. That you walk the edge of a thing in the dark, because the edge is the part that holds. She found the barn door by feel. She got it open, and she fell inside, out of the worst of it, into a roaring dark that was only slightly less terrible than the night behind her. Inside, the storm was a sound more than a force. It pressed on the old walls. It found every gap in the siding and made a low, mournful note through each one, so the whole barn seemed to be moaning around her. A chorus of small, frightened voices. She got the flashlight back out. She swept it up, and her stomach dropped. The roof was worse than she'd feared. That long, low section on the north side. The one that sagged like a held breath. It was moving now, not much. A slow flex, in and out, in time with the gusts. Each time the wind shoved against it, the old boards bowed inward a little further, groaning, and each time the wind eased, they sprang back. But not all the way back. A little less, each time. She had seen enough by now to read what that meant. It was tiring. The way a person tires. The way a back tires under a load it has carried too long. One more push too many, and it would not spring back at all. And under it, the crates, the bottles. Her grandmother's whole quiet life, stacked exactly where it had always been. Right in the path of it. She didn't let herself think about whether she could do this. Thinking was the enemy now. Thinking was the 4 seconds in which a room decides you'll fail. She just moved, the crates first. She got her hands under the bottom one and heaved, and it barely shifted, heavy with glass and years, the straw inside whispering. She braced her boots and tried again. It scraped a few inches across the packed dirt floor. A few inches. She looked at the stack. There were so many. And the failing roof above them flexed again, groaned again, dropped a little dust and grit down into the flashlight beam. She would never move them all in time. Not alone. But she could move some. So she chose. She went for the cases first. The dark wax-sealed bottles, because those were the ones the notebook spoke of as finished, as done, as the years her grandmother could never get back. She dragged them one at a time toward the south wall, away from the sagging section, her shoulders screaming, her breath tearing, the apron strap digging into the back of her neck. One case, then another, then another. The wind screamed. The roof bowed. She did not stop. She was on the 5th case when the first board let go. It wasn't dramatic. That was almost the worst of it. No great crash. Just a sharp, wet crack somewhere above her in the dark. And then a long, slow shudder running the length of the north roof, like a spine giving way one piece at a time. She froze, the case half lifted in her arms. Snow began to sift down through a new gap, fine as flour, ghostly in the beam. The roof was going. Not all at once, but it had started. And once a thing like that starts, her grandfather's voice said somewhere in her, "They go quick." She set the case down. She looked up at the failing roof, and at all the crates she hadn't moved yet, and at the small, impossible math of it. And for one moment, one single moment, she felt the old fear come back. The crackers at the table, the closed cellar door, the voice that said, "You are 19 and alone, and the whole world has already done the arithmetic." She felt her arms shake. And then, over the roar of the wind, she heard something else. An engine. Headlights swung across the grimy east windows. A truck coming up the lane far too fast for the conditions, fishtailing in the drifts, its beams cutting through the blowing snow like something out of a dream. It slid to a stop in the yard. A door slammed, and then the barn door was hauled open against the wind, and a shape came through it, broad and bent and coated white in seconds, stamping snow off boots, swearing low and steady at the cold. Abel Reed. He took one look at the sagging roof, one look at the crates, one look at the girl standing there in a dead woman's apron with her arms shaking, and he didn't ask a single question. "Posts," he said. "Your grandfather kept fence posts in the lean-to. Long ones. Go." She went. What happened next? She would never be able to tell in proper order. It came back to her afterward only in pieces. The weight of the fence posts, the way Abel jammed one up against the bowing section of roof and braced its foot against a floor beam and threw his whole body behind it. The way he shouted instructions over the wind, short and flat and certain, and the way she found, to her own surprise, that her hands knew how to follow them. They braced the roof, post by post, each one wedged hard against the failing boards, each one taking a little of the load the old timbers could no longer carry alone. It was rough. It was ugly. It was the kind of fix a man makes in the dark with whatever's nearest, knowing it only has to hold until morning. But it held. The roof stopped its slow inward bow. The posts groaned and took the weight, and the boards above settled against them, and the terrible flexing eased. And then the two of them moved crates. Together. It went 4 times as fast with 2, maybe more. She'd take one end and he'd take the other, and they walked the years of her grandmother's life across that dirt floor to the safe south wall, case after case, until the path of the failing roof was clear. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing to say that the work wasn't already saying. When it was done, they stood in the roaring dark, both of them heaving for breath, both of them coated in snow and dust and the sweat of it. Abel ran the flashlight up over their work, the braced posts, the cleared floor, the crates and cases stacked safe against the south wall. He nodded once, slow. "It'll hold the night," he said. "We'll do it proper when the weather breaks." She heard the word. She didn't say anything about it, but she heard it, and something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since an overheated room 2 weeks ago, eased by the smallest degree. He looked at the crates, at the dark, wax-sealed bottles catching the flashlight beam. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, quietly, "So that's what was in here." "That's what was in here," she said. He was silent again, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, gone lower, gone careful. "Your grandmother," he said. "She used to bring something to the old gatherings, years back, long before your time." He shook his head slowly. "Best thing on the whole table. Nobody ever knew where it came from. She'd never say, just smile and let folks wonder." He looked at the girl. "I always figured she'd taken the how of it with her," he said. "I'm glad to be wrong." He didn't stay long after that. He had his own place to see to, his own roof, his own animals in the dark. But before he climbed back into the truck, he stopped, one hand on the door, the way he had the first time. "Your grandfather," he said. "He locked this barn up tight. Years ago. Chained it and kept the key and never said why." He squinted at her through the blowing snow. "Some of us wondered if there'd been a falling out between the two of them. Folks talk." The girl said nothing. She waited. "But a man doesn't guard a thing that hard," Abel said slowly, "unless he means to protect it. There's a difference between locking something away and keeping it safe." He let that sit a moment. "You'll figure out which one it was," he said. And then he was gone, the headlights swinging away down the lane, swallowed by the white. She did not go back to the house right away. She found her grandmother's notebook where she'd left it, wrapped in a feed sack inside the doorway, dry. She'd brought it out with her into the storm without quite letting herself wonder why. As if it should not be apart from the things it spoke of. As if it belonged out here, with the bottles, on a night like this. She sat down on a safe crate, against the safe south wall, under the braced and groaning roof. And by flashlight, with the storm still raging against the old walls, she finally let herself read the part she had been circling all along. The final third. The last entries. The ones written close to the end. The handwriting had changed. She saw it at once. The careful, slanting hand had gone tighter, more deliberate, as if her grandmother had known she was running low on pages and was rationing the space. The dates were spaced further apart. Where the early entries had come close together, a steady record of daily work, these came weeks apart, sometimes a long while between one and the next. And the tone had shifted. The girl couldn't name it at first. It wasn't sadness. It was more like a woman closing the windows of a house before a long trip, setting things in order, making sure the latches caught. One of the late entries spoke of the bottles in the cellar, not as product, not as process, as something finished. So many of this batch still sealed. So many of that one, racked in the back row under a cloth. The remainder of the small batch set aside. And then, in smaller writing below, almost a note to herself. Seals checked. Wax still good. The cold will hold them. The girl read that line, and she had to stop. The cold will hold them. She had known. Her grandmother had known she would not be there to tend them. She had gone down into that cellar near the end and checked every seal with her own hands and made certain the cold would do the keeping she could no longer do herself. She had not been hoarding. She had been waiting for someone who hadn't come yet. The last entry was short. It came 12 days after the one before it, by the spacing of things. And it wasn't about cider at all. She wrote about the orchard, about one tree in particular. The oldest one, the one with the split trunk, down by the stone wall, the one the girl had climbed as a child and secretly named for the way it leaned, low and gray and patient, like something out of a story. Her grandmother wrote that the tree had been standing there when her own mother was a girl, that it was older than anyone living, that it had given fruit through droughts and hard winters and years when everything else failed, and that it had never once asked for thanks. "I hope it stands another 100 years," she wrote. "I hope someone is here to see it." And then the writing stopped. There was no period at the end of that last line, no final mark, just the words, and then the pencil lifting off the page, mid-thought, the way a voice trails off when someone is called away from a conversation they meant to finish. And after it, blank pages. The girl turned them, one after another, in the flashlight beam. 30 of them, maybe more. All empty, all waiting. She sat very still. She had been reading it wrong. She understood that now, all at once, sitting in the cold barn with the storm pressing on the walls and the braced roof groaning over her head. She had been treating the notebook as a technical thing, a recipe, a guide, a blueprint she could take apart and rebuild into a way to save the farm. And it was those things. It was all of those things. But it was something else first. It was a letter, not addressed to anyone in particular, not to a daughter or a granddaughter, or a name, addressed instead to whoever came next, and was willing to sit long enough in the cold and the dark to read all the way to the end. The blank pages weren't an ending. They were an invitation. Her grandmother hadn't run out of things to say. The girl was certain of that now. A woman who closed the windows before a trip, who checked every seal, who left the cold to do her keeping. That woman did nothing by accident. She had left the pages empty on purpose, because she understood, better than anyone, that whoever came next would need room. Room to keep going. And then, sitting there, the second understanding arrived, the larger one. The one that had been waiting at the bottom of all of it, under the bottles and the notebook and the locked door, for her to be ready. Her grandfather. She thought about the chain, the shrouded lock, the 4 words to a small girl pointing across a field. Nothing in there. Stay out. She thought about what Abel had said, his hand on the truck door, the snow coming down. Folks wondered if there'd been a falling out. Some of us wondered why he guarded it so hard. And she thought about the line on the back of the workbench list in his broad, pressing hand. Her ratios do not change, not without asking her first. She had read that the first day as a kind of rule, an instruction, almost a warning. She read it differently now. It wasn't a rule. It was reverence. A man telling whoever came after him, this was hers. This was always hers. Don't you dare change a thing she made without honoring her first. He had not locked the barn to bury his wife's work. He had locked it to keep it. The whole shape of it turned over in the dark, and the girl saw it whole for the first time. She did not know everything. She would never know everything. There were things between the two of them, between her grandmother and her grandfather, that had happened long before she was born and had died with the both of them. Maybe there had been a falling out once. Maybe in a season when the world told a woman her work didn't matter, the man who should have stood beside her had stood somewhere else instead. Maybe he had been one of the room that decided in 4 seconds. Maybe, for years, he had been part of the silence she had to hide inside. The notebook didn't say. It wasn't her grandmother's way to say. But the lock said something. The lock said that whatever he had been, whatever he had failed to be when it mattered most, in the end, he had understood. In the end, he had spent years guarding a chained door so that no one could ever again pour their judgment over the thing his wife had made. He had kept her ratios sacred. He had written "ask her first" as if she were still in the next room, as if her permission still mattered, as if it had always mattered, and he was only now learning to say so. And then, dying, with a shaking hand on the back of a seed catalog, he had not let it end with him. He had pointed his granddaughter at the cellar. Look in the cellar first. He had handed her the trail. It was, she understood, the only apology he knew how to make. He was not a man of words. He had labeled jars instead of saying he loved someone. He had moved a tool quietly back to its place instead of speaking a correction aloud. His whole language had been the silent setting right of things. And this, the chain, the key in the box, the one word north, the note that sent her down into the dark. This was the largest silent setting right of his life. "I'm sorry," the lock said. "I'm proud of you," the key said. "Don't let it end," said the seed catalog, in a hand that was already shaking. He had spent his last clear thought making sure his wife's lifetime would not be lost, making sure someone would come and open the door and find her waiting there in the cold, exactly as she'd left herself. And someone had. The girl sat in the barn her grandmother had built and her grandfather had guarded, and she put her hand flat on the open notebook, and she let herself cry, finally, for the two of them. Not just for the loss, for the love that had been hiding inside the loss the whole time, locked away where the cold could keep it. The storm began to ease near dawn. She felt it before she heard it, the dropping of that long, mournful note through the gaps in the walls, the wind giving up its hold 1 degree at a time. She had not slept. She had read the whole notebook through, front to back, by failing flashlight. And somewhere in the small hours, the reading had stopped being study and become something more like prayer. When the gray light finally came up through the grimy east windows, it fell across the braced roof and the cleared floor, and the crates and cases stacked safe against the south wall. Nothing had been lost. The roof had held. The bottles had held. The years had held. The cold had done its keeping. One more night. She stood, stiff and aching, every part of her spent, and she looked at the small barn in the new light, and it was not the same place it had been the day she'd broken the chain. That day, it had been a mystery, a locked door, a question. Now it was something else. It was a workroom, a record, a letter, and an apology, and a 100-year-old tree, and two people who had loved this land and each other in their own difficult, silent, imperfect ways. It was hers now, not as a burden, not as a debt, as an inheritance, in the truest sense of that word. A thing handed forward, a conversation she had been invited to join, on the condition that she be willing to read all the way to the end. She had read to the end. She picked up the notebook and the flashlight, and she pulled her grandmother's apron straight over her grandfather's coat, LEH across her chest, the two of them carried together now the way they should have been all along. and she stepped out of the barn into the first calm, brutal, beautiful morning after the storm. The house was colder than she'd left it. The fire had burned down to almost nothing in the long hours she'd spent in the barn, and the pot under the failing ceiling had filled and overflowed and made a dark, spreading shape across the floorboards. She didn't look at it long. A wet floor could be dried. A roof could be patched. These were the small problems now. And she had learned, somewhere in the storm, the difference between the small problems and the large ones. She went straight to the mudroom. The crate was where she'd left it, tucked against the inside wall, away from the worst of the draft. And inside it, the hen, the off one, the one that had stood apart by the east wall, head low, that sometimes meant nothing and sometimes meant the start of an ending. She crouched down and looked in. The hen looked back at her. And then she stood, shook herself, took a step, and made a low, irritated sound that was, unmistakably, a complaint. The girl let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "All right," she said softly. "All right then, you stubborn thing." She reached in and lifted the hen out, and it grumbled the whole way, and she carried it back to the coop through the unbroken white, her boots punching deep holes in the new snow, and she set it down among the others where it belonged. 11 again. In a winter that had taken so much, she had not lost one. It was a small thing. It was the smallest thing. And standing there in the brutal, beautiful morning, with the field buried white to the tree line, she found that the small thing had a weight to it she could barely hold. She went back inside and built the fire up properly. She mopped the floor. She emptied the pot. She set a fresh one and slid a folded towel under it. And she did all of this slowly, with care, the way her grandfather would have done it. And the work itself was a kind of steadying. When the kitchen had warmed enough to stop seeing her breath, she sat down at the table with the notebook. And she did something she had not done before. She read it again, from the beginning, but not as a student this time, not hunting for the how of it, the measures and the temperatures and the rules. She read it as a granddaughter. She read it the way you reread the letters of someone you've lost, once the first grief has burned down to coals. Slower, gentler. Listening now, not for the information, but for the person hiding inside it. And the person was everywhere. In the small jokes she'd missed the first time. In the way her grandmother had written, "Be patient" to herself, again and again, like a woman who knew her own restless nature and was forever trying to tame it. In the pride she let herself feel only on the page, where no one could pour their judgment over it. There was a whole woman in those pages, a whole life lived mostly in silence, set down in a hand that slanted gently to the right. And the girl, who had grown up thinking of her grandmother as a soft and distant fragment, a voice, a pair of hands, a card once a year, met her now, fully, for the first time, years too late, and somehow, also, exactly on time. The light was full when the truck came up the lane. She heard it before she saw it, the engine careful on the frozen ruts, and she went to the window, and there was Abel Reed, climbing down with a coil of something over one shoulder and a ladder in the bed behind him. He'd said he would come back and do the roof proper. She had not been certain he meant it. People said such things. The saying of them cost nothing. But here he was, in the cold, with a ladder. She pulled on her boots and went out to meet him. "Didn't think the storm would let you out so early," she said. "Storm let up before dawn," he said, hauling the ladder down. "And a braced roof is a borrowed thing. You don't leave it borrowed longer than you have to." He looked at her then, took in the apron over the coat, LEH across her chest. Something in his weathered face went still and soft. He didn't say anything about it, but he looked at it a long moment, the way a man looks at something he recognizes from a long time ago. And then he picked up the ladder and carried it toward the small barn. And she followed. They worked the morning through. He showed her things without making a lesson of them. How to read which boards were sound and which had given up. How to pull the bad ones without bringing more down with them. How to set the new against the old so the seam wouldn't catch the wind and tear loose again with the next hard blow. She handed him what he needed before he asked for it. She'd gotten quick at that this winter, watching, anticipating, learning the shape of a job by paying attention to the hands doing it. It was, she realized, exactly how her grandmother must have learned everything in that notebook. Not from a teacher, from attention, from doing the thing badly, and then less badly, and then one slow day. Well, around midday, they stopped to rest, and Abel sat on a crate and looked at the dark, wax-sealed bottles stacked safe against the south wall, and he was quiet for a while. "She'd come to the gatherings," he said finally. "Your grandmother, years and years ago. She'd bring a little of this." He nodded at the bottles. "Never much, just enough to share. And folks would carry on about it all night, never knowing whose hands had made it." He shook his head slowly. "There were men at those tables," he said, "who'd have sworn up and down a woman couldn't make a thing like that. Swore it with a glass of the very thing in their hand. Never once put the two together." He looked at the girl. "She let them go on believing it," he said. "I used to think that was a sadness, a waste, all that, hidden." "And now?" the girl asked. Abel was quiet a moment. "Now I think she just got tired of handing people the chance to be wrong about her," he said. "So she stopped, kept it for herself, for the joy of it." He gestured at the room around them, the workbench, the pegs, the years. Built herself a place where nobody got a vote on what she was worth. The girl looked at the small barn with new eyes again. It kept happening. Every time she thought she understood the place, it showed her one more layer. "That's not hiding," she said slowly. "That's protecting something." "There's a difference," Abel said. "I told you that, the night of the storm." He stood and brushed off his hands. "You're starting to hear it." When the roof was done, it was a sound thing, not pretty. The new board stood out pale against the weathered gray. But it would hold the next storm, and the one after. And that was all a roof was ever asked to do. Abel loaded his ladder back into the truck, and before he left, he stood looking at the small barn, hands in his coat pockets. "You going to keep it?" he asked. "Not the farm, the work." He nodded at the bottles. "All of it?" The girl looked at the barn, at the trees beyond it, bare and patient under the snow, at the oldest one down by the wall, leaning low and gray. "I don't know yet how," she said honestly. "But yes." "Good," Abel said. And then, quietly, almost to himself, he'd be glad of that. Your grandfather. More than he'd ever have been able to say. He climbed into the truck. Folks were wrong about you, he added through the open window. I was, that first morning. Did the same arithmetic everyone does. I'm not too proud to tell you I was wrong. It was, she understood, a large thing for a man like him to say. She held it the way you hold something fragile. Thank you, she said, and he nodded once and drove down the lane, and this time the sound of him faded slow and easy, with no storm to swallow it. That afternoon, she went down into the cellar, not to fight the bank, not to count what she could sell. She went down for the same reason her grandmother had gone down near the end, to check the seals. She moved along the shelves with a quiet, patient care, pressing the center of each sealed lid with her thumb, feeling for that clean, firm resistance that meant the cold had done its keeping. Feeling for the soft give that meant it hadn't. Most held. A few had gone soft over the long years, and those she set aside, gently, without opening them, the way you set aside something that did its best and simply ran out of time. But most held. And as she worked her way along the rows, pressing each seal her grandmother had pressed before her, she felt something she could not have explained to anyone in town. Her hand on the lid where another hand had been. Years between them, and stone, and grief, and silence. And yet, the same gesture, the same care, the same checking, in the same cold, of the same patient work. It was the closest thing to holding her grandmother's hand that she would ever have. She stayed down there a long time. When she came back up, the light was going. She lit the lamp and set the kettle on, and she sat at the table with the notebook open to the last written page, to that final line about the old tree trailing off with no period, and the blank pages waiting behind it. She looked at those blank pages for a long while, 30 of them, maybe more, cream-colored, empty, patient, room to keep going, she thought. And she got up, and she went to the drawer where her grandfather had kept his pencils, the careful ones he labeled jars with. And she took one out. She came back to the table. She turned past the last of her grandmother's words, to the first of the empty pages, and she sat there with the pencil in her hand for the longest time. The way you sit before saying something you've waited your whole life to say. She didn't know yet what to write. It felt too soon, too large. The story wasn't finished. The fight wasn't won. There was still a date under the sugar tin, and a buyer she'd never seen who wanted her trees and her creek and her grandmother's 100 years, and 100 mornings of hard work between her and anything you could call a victory. She wasn't ready to write the ending, so she didn't. Instead, at the top of the first blank page, in a hand that did not slant the way her grandmother's had, but pressed the way her grandfather's did, she wrote one line. The cold held them, all but a few. I'm here now. I'm going to keep going. It wasn't a recipe. It wasn't a rule. It was an answer. The first words written back, across years of silence, to a woman who had left the door open and trusted that someone, someday, would walk through it. She closed the notebook. She put her hand flat on the cover, the way she had that very first night, when it was still a mystery and a stranger's hand. It was not a stranger's anymore. That night, she slept. For the first time since the overheated room and the kind, terrible face, she slept deeply and without dreaming, the way you sleep when something heavy has finally been set down. Not gone, but understood, carried differently, shared, and when she woke, in the gray before the light, it was not to fear. It was to a list. The roof of the house, still failing, still waiting. The bottles, sorted now into what held and what hadn't. The path Della had drawn for her on a little card, slow and full of work, but real. The names, the permissions, the mornings of labor ahead. And the date. Always the date. She lay in the narrow bed and let it all arrange itself in her mind. And she found that it no longer felt like a wall she was being crushed against. It felt like a field that needed turning, large, cold, slow, but workable if a person got out there in the window that was left and bent into it and didn't stop. She got up. She built the fire. She made the coffee. She poured it into the white mug with the faded green stripe, the one that had been washed 10,000 times and still held its shape. And she stood at the window over the sink, looking out at the field buried white, and the small barn with its pale new roof, and the orchard beyond, and the oldest tree of all, leaning low and gray and patient by the wall, the one her grandmother had hoped would stand another 100 years. "I hope someone is here to see it," her grandmother had written. The girl wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "Someone's here," she said quietly, to the empty kitchen, to the woman years gone, to the man who had pointed her into the dark. "Someone's here, and she's not selling." The fight wasn't over. She knew that, standing there in the cold morning. The hardest part was still ahead of her, out past the calm of this one healed day. The buyer she'd never met, the lawyers with deeper pockets, the date bearing down, the slow, uncertain, uphill work of turning a notebook full of a dead woman's courage into something that could actually save a farm. She might still lose it. That was the truth. And she had stopped lying to herself about truths. But she was not the girl who had sat frozen in a truck that wouldn't warm, watching a stranger decide her future in 4 seconds. That girl had been alone and afraid and certain the arithmetic was right. This one knew better. She knew that a room deciding you'll fail is not the same as failing. She knew that the quietest work is often the strongest. She knew that an inheritance is not a burden or a debt, no matter what the letters under the sugar tin said. It is a conversation handed forward that you are invited to continue. And she knew now that she had never truly been alone out here at all. Her grandmother was in the notebook, and the bottles, and the trees. Her grandfather was in the lock, and the key, and the one word, north. Abel was 3 farms east, with a ladder and a memory, and the grace to admit he'd been wrong. Della was in town, behind a counter, with a card full of names and a stubborn refusal to count people out. They were all of them with her. The girl set down the empty mug and pulled on her grandfather's coat and tied her grandmother's apron over it. The two of them carried together, the way they should always have been. And she stepped out into the cold morning to begin the work. There was a roof to mend, a path to walk, a farm to save or to lose trying. And somewhere in town, a man with a kind, terrible face was about to learn that the girl he'd counted out in 4 seconds was only just getting started. The work began the morning after the storm, and it did not stop. There is no single day when a farm is saved. She learned that fast. It isn't one grand moment. It's 100 small ones, stacked the way her grandfather stacked firewood, each one ordinary, each one nothing by itself, and somehow the whole of them holding back the winter. She started with the card Della had given her. She made the calls. She drove the cold roads to offices at the edges of small towns and sat across desks from people who, more often than not, did the same arithmetic the banker had done. Too young, too small, in over her head. She let them do it. She had stopped flinching at the math. She came prepared instead. She brought the notebook, wrapped careful in a clean cloth. She brought a few of the bottles whose seals had held. She brought the quiet, patient certainty of a woman who had read a lifetime of records and knew now exactly what she was holding. And one by one, the rooms began to change their minds. It was slow. The path Della had drawn was real, but it was long. There were permissions that took weeks to come, forms that had to be filled and filled again, lines she had to learn the difference between, the ones that truly couldn't be crossed, and the ones that were only fears people carried because no one had ever told them otherwise. She learned all of it. She sat at the kitchen table late into the cold nights, the lamp hissing, the notebook open beside the paperwork, and she taught herself the rules the way her grandmother had taught herself the trees. By attention, by doing it wrong, and then less wrong, and then one slow night, right? And every time she wanted to quit, every time the date under the sugar tin pressed too hard between her shoulder blades, she turned to the last written page of the notebook. I hope someone is here to see it. Someone's here, she'd say to the empty kitchen, and she'd pick the pencil back up. The first time she brought it to market, she nearly didn't go. It was the last small gathering of the cold season, the kind where folks set up tables in the gray morning and sold what they'd put up over the long, dark months. Preserves, honey, bread. The quiet work of quiet people, trying to make it to spring. She'd spent the night before sick with nerves, because she knew what would happen. She'd watched it happen to her grandmother in the pages of the notebook. A young woman, alone, setting out something she'd made with her own 2 hands. And a crowd that would decide, in about the time it takes to pour a glass, that it couldn't possibly be any good because of who'd made it. She almost left the bottles at home. She almost brought only the preserves, the peach, the apple butter, the green tomato relish, the safe things, the things no one would think twice about a young woman making. But then she stood in the cold kitchen in the dark before dawn, and she looked at her grandmother's apron hanging by the door, and she thought about all the years that woman had hidden the best thing on every table because she'd gotten tired of handing people the chance to be wrong about her. And the girl thought, not this time, not anymore. She packed the bottles, she tied on the apron, LEH across her chest, and she drove into the dark. She set up her table while the frost was still white on the ground. She laid out the preserves in neat rows, the colors of stained glass even in the gray light. And then, after a moment's hesitation, she set out a few of the bottles too. The dark glass, the wax seals, cracked with age, the years. She put up a small hand-lettered card. It didn't say her name. It said only, "Made on this land. The old way. by the hands that came before and the ones here now. And then she stood behind her table in 2 coats too big for her, and she waited for the arithmetic to begin. It began the way it always did. People slowed at her table and looked at her, and she watched the math happen behind their eyes. Young, alone. Surely doesn't know what she's doing. A man picked up one of the bottles, turned it over, frowned at the unlabeled glass. "What is this, then?" he asked, not unkindly, just doubtful. "Something my grandmother made," she said, "and kept, for a long time." He raised an eyebrow. "Your grandmother?" "Yes." She saw the doubt deepen. She'd known it would. She'd braced for it. But she did not look away, and she did not apologize, and she did not shrink the way she might have a few weeks before. She held his gaze the way Abel had held the field that first morning. Low, stubborn, certain. "It's good," she said simply. "Better than good. You can wonder about that, or you can find out." Something in the steadiness of it caught him off guard. He bought a bottle. Just to prove her wrong, she thought. Just to settle the doubt one way or the other. She watched him walk off into the crowd with it, and she went back to waiting. He came back 20 minutes later. He came back with 2 other men, and he didn't say a word about being wrong. He just set down the money for 3 more bottles, and he looked at her with something that hadn't been there before, a kind of careful, surprised respect. And he said, "Where can a person get more of this?" That was the first crack in the wall. After that, the morning turned. Word moved through the small crowd the way it does in places where everyone knows everyone. The girl at the end table, the old recipe. You have to taste it. People came who hadn't meant to. Older folks, mostly. The kind who remembered a flavor from a long time ago and couldn't place it. And then placed it suddenly, their faces opening with a memory they'd thought was lost. "This tastes like," one old woman said, and then stopped, and her eyes filled, and she didn't finish. She didn't have to. The girl knew. It tasted like a table from a long time ago, like a gathering, like a flavor someone had carried on every table for years and never once claimed. "You knew her," the girl said softly. "Everyone knew her," the old woman said, or thought they did. It was the 3rd time the girl had heard those exact words, and this time she understood them all the way down. By mid-morning, the preserves were gone. By noon, the bottles were gone too. 3 different people pressed cards and scraps of paper into her hands, asking if she sold in larger amounts. One woman who ran a small shop a county over asked her, plainly, to call before the season turned. Another simply held one of the empty bottles for a long moment, turning it in the light, and said, "Don't you dare let this disappear again. You hear me? Don't you dare." The girl drove home through the bare white fields with an empty truck and a full heart and a folder of names on the seat beside her. And she understood that she had done, in one morning, the thing her grandmother had been too tired and too hurt to do. She had set it on the table, and she had let them be right about it, instead of letting them be wrong about her. It was not enough to save the farm. Not yet. Not by itself. One good market doesn't pay a debt that's been growing for years. But it was proof. Proof that the path was real. Proof that the work would sell, and sell well, to people who were hungry for exactly the thing her grandmother had made in secret all those years. Proof she could carry into the next hard room, and the next, and lay down on the desk like a card she finally knew the value of. She took that proof, and she went to see about the debt. The man with the kind, terrible face was not the one who held it anymore. She'd learned that from Della. The note had been sold to someone with deeper pockets and faster lawyers, someone who wanted the land, the trees, the creek, someone who had looked at a girl of 19 at the end of a gravel lane and decided, sight unseen, that she'd be glad to be rid of it all. She had never met him. She met him now. He came to the farm himself in the end. She had not expected that. A long, clean car came up the frozen lane one gray afternoon, careful of the ruts, and a man got out who did not belong to the cold. Soft hands. A coat made for looking at, not for working in. The kind of man who had never once broken ice on a waterer with the side of his fist. He looked at the house, at the failing roof, half mended now, at the small barn with its pale new boards. And then he looked at her, and she watched the arithmetic begin, the same arithmetic, the oldest one, and she let it run, and she said nothing, and she waited. "You'd be the granddaughter," he said. "I would." He smiled. It was a practiced smile, a smile with a number behind it. "I'll be honest with you," he said, in the voice of a man who was about to be anything but. "A place like this, at your age, alone, it's a great deal to carry. I think we both know that. I'm prepared to make it easy on you, more than fair. You could walk away from all this worry tomorrow." He named a number. It was, she understood, meant to sound like a rescue, a rope thrown to a drowning girl. It was also, she understood, a fraction of what the land was worth to a man who wanted the water and the trees and the 100 years. She let the number sit in the cold air between them. "You came all the way out here yourself," she said. "For a place a girl my age was supposed to be glad to give up." His smile flickered, just slightly. "You don't do that," she went on, slow and even. "For a farm you think is worthless. You don't send the lawyers, and then come yourself, and offer to make it easy, unless you already know exactly what's out here." She nodded toward the orchard, the bare trees, the oldest one leaning low and gray by the wall. "The trees," she said, "the water, the land that doesn't come up twice in a lifetime." She watched his face. "You counted on me not knowing what I was sitting on. You counted on a girl being too scared and too alone and too tired to find out." The man said nothing for a moment, and in that nothing, she had her answer. "I'm not selling," she said. She said it quietly. There was no anger in it. She had learned this winter that the strongest things are usually the quietest. That a room deciding you'll fail is not the same as failing. That you do not have to shout to refuse. "The debt is real," she said. "I won't pretend it isn't. But there's a path through it that doesn't end with you taking this land, and I'm walking it, slow and hard, and one form at a time." She lifted her chin. "You can wait for me to fail. Plenty of people are. But you'll be waiting a long while. Because I'm not the girl you did the math on. I never was." The man looked at her, and something in his soft face shifted. Not respect exactly. Men like him didn't part with respect easily, but recalibration. The same look Abel had given her on a frozen morning, and the banker had not. The look of a man realizing the number on the page no longer matched the person in front of him. "You'll struggle," he said. A last small cruelty. Probably, she said, but it'll be my struggle, on my land, with her work. She nodded toward the small barn. And that's worth more to me than easy ever could be. He got back in his clean car, and he drove down the lane, careful of the ruts. And she stood in the cold and watched him go. And she did not feel triumphant. She felt something steadier than that. She felt like a woman who knew, finally, exactly what she was standing on. It took the rest of that long, cold stretch to make it real. There was no single victory. That much should be understood, if anyone ever asks. There was no dramatic mourning when the debt vanished and the danger passed. That isn't how it goes. Out at the end of a gravel lane. There was only the work, the markets growing slowly larger, the shop a county over that took her bottles and asked for more, the careful permissions coming through one at a time, the names on the cards, becoming customers, becoming a small growing thing with her grandmother's hands at the root of it and her own at the stem. There were hard weeks, weeks she nearly didn't make it. Weeks the date under the sugar tin felt like the only true thing in the world. But the path held. She paid down the debt the way her grandfather stacked firewood, one ordinary piece at a time, each one nothing by itself, the whole of them somehow holding back the winter. And the day finally came. She would never forget the quiet of it, when the last of it was paid, when the land was hers, free and clear, with no man's lawyers reaching for it, and no number meant to sound like a rescue. She did not celebrate. She went down into the cellar instead, and she pressed her thumb to the seals her grandmother had pressed, one by one, in the cold and the dark. And she said, very quietly, "It's safe. They can't take it now. I kept it. I kept all of it." And the silence that answered her did not feel empty. It felt like a woman, somewhere, finally able to set down a thing she'd carried alone for far too long. The seasons turned, the way they do. The white field went to dark mud, and then to green. The orchard that had stood bare and patient all winter came suddenly, foolishly, gloriously into blossom. And the oldest tree of all, the one with the split trunk by the wall, the one her grandmother had hoped would stand another 100 years, bloomed heaviest of all. She stood under it one warm evening, looking up through the branches at the last of the light. She was not the girl who had sat frozen in a truck that wouldn't warm. She would never be that girl again. The winter had taken her, and the work had made her into someone else. Someone with rough hands and a steady gaze and a small, growing thing that bore her grandmother's mark and her own. Abel still came by, less for work now, more for coffee. He'd sit at her table and grumble about the weather and tell her things about her grandparents she'd never have known otherwise, small things, true things, and she'd write the best of them down. Della had become something like a grandmother of her own, the kind you choose, the kind who refuses, on principle, to count anyone out. The town had changed its arithmetic, not all at once, towns never do, but slowly, the way the season changes, one person at a time recalibrating, the way the banker never had and Abel finally did. The girl at the end of the lane. Turns out she knew what she was doing all along. Turns out she's her grandmother's, through and through. She let them say it. She had stopped needing them to be right about her a long time ago. On a quiet evening, With the orchard in bloom and the work of the day finally done, she sat at the kitchen table with the notebook. She turned past her grandmother's last words, past that final line, trailing off with no period about the old tree and the hope that someone would be here to see it. She turned to the empty pages, to the one line she'd written on the night of the storm, in a hand that pressed the way her grandfather's did. The cold held them, all but a few. I'm here now. I'm going to keep going. And below it, she began, at last, to write. Not a recipe. Not yet. Those would come in time, batch after careful batch, in her own slow hand. She wrote instead the way her grandmother had, a record of the work, a note about the trees, the pride she'd let herself feel only on the page, where once no one could pour their judgment over it, except now she found she didn't need to hide it there anymore. The judgment had lost its power over her, somewhere in the long cold. She could feel proud in the open now. That was the thing the winter had given her. The thing her grandmother had never quite been allowed. She wrote until the light was gone. And when she set the pencil down, she did not close the notebook the way you close a book that's finished. She left it open to the next blank page, the one waiting after the one she'd filled, because that was the whole lesson in the end. The one her grandmother had built into the silence of all those empty pages. You do not finish it. You carry it as far as you can. You do the work, and you keep the records, and you protect the thing you've made even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. And then you leave room. Room for the next pair of hands. Room for whoever comes after and is willing to sit long enough in the cold and the dark to read all the way to the end. She still doesn't tell people when they ask that it was easy. It wasn't. It was the hardest thing. And she doesn't tell them it was about the money or the land or even, in the end, about saving the farm. Though it was about all of those things, too. When they ask her now, carefully, the way people ask, whether she's glad she stayed, whether she ever thinks about the easier life she walked away from, the one she was supposed to want, she just smiles, and she looks out the window toward the small barn with its pale-patched roof, and the orchard, and the oldest tree of all, leaning low and gray and patient, heavy with another season's bloom. And she thinks about a woman who built something beautiful in silence, because the world wouldn't let her build it any other way. And a man who could not say the soft things in words, so he said them in a chain, and a key, and one word written on tape. North. And she thinks about what the two of them left her. Not the debt, not the failing roof, not the cold. They left her the proof that quiet work matters, that a person is worth more than the arithmetic of any room that ever counted her out, that an inheritance is not a thing you are handed. It is a thing you are trusted to carry forward. She doesn't say any of that, of course. She just smiles and pours them a little of something made on this land, the old way, by the hands that came before and the ones here now. And she lets them be right about it, the way she should have been allowed to be, the way her grandmother never quite was all along.